Hello, this is a brief tutorial on mapping learning outcomes, something that we will be discussing or reviewing as part of program assessment in program review. So what is mapping? Mapping is a way of showing which outcomes are supported by which. It shows which program outcomes are supported by course outcomes and which institutional outcomes are supported by course outcomes and service outcomes, by the way. I should have added that too. So for instance, here's a program outcome, the English AAT degree. Students will be able to do two things, at least. And these learning outcomes are supported by outcomes in the courses that make up the English program, at least one. So the Literature 201 class has an outcome that supports both. A business class, which is one of the options for the English degree, supports the first program outcome. The English 110 supports both, unsurprisingly. The Chinese class outcome supports this first one. So it shows you the role of these courses in the program. Then there's also institutional outcomes. Now, as I say, they're quite long. Each one has quite a list of things that students are able to do, but this is the short list. And again, here's one of the institutional learning outcomes. That was something we want students to be able to do as a result of taking a GE pattern for a degree or a transfer pattern. Now, this outcome, effective communication, is supported by an outcome in English 100, an outcome in Chemistry 220, an outcome in dental assisting, an outcome in art. These all are outcomes which speak to a student's ability to communicate. So that's what the map does. It kind of shows you how things relate. Why is it useful for assessment? Well, when you're looking at your program, your degree or certificate, thinking about which outcomes support which program outcomes help us make sure that the program is coherent and current. So the goal is really for faculty to have a focused discussion on curriculum to ensure a clear path to the program learning goals. It's in the spirit of guided pathways. For faculty also to review and reflect on the outcomes. And here are some of the red flags. You might find a course even in your discipline, but quite possibly outside it, that is part of your program. But maybe the outcomes have changed and you don't know about it and it no longer relates. Maybe you'll find looking at some of the elective courses, they don't really support any program outcomes. Now, going back for a minute to the English degree one, they don't have to support them directly. Here, for instance, the Chinese class is one of all the language classes which are part of our English degree. In order to get an English degree, we feel like you really should have, acquainted yourself at least a bit with another language. Now, that doesn't directly relate to analyzing and responding critically to literary expository texts, demonstrating knowledge of a variety of authors, but we felt like, learning Chinese, particularly this outcome where you learn short dialogues and narratives on life situations, probably would help you ultimately make sense of texts. So the connection doesn't have to be obvious to everybody as long as it's understandable to the faculty who make the map. However, this does kind of point to one of our red flags, which is a program that doesn't look like it quite belongs. Now, maybe that's not a fault of the program. It doesn't necessarily mean we want to drop foreign languages from the English degree. In fact, no way. But it does suggest that maybe our program outcomes don't really tell the whole story. So that's an opportunity to rethink what we want to do with the program outcomes. And that, by the way, leads to this fourth bullet point. Programs evolve, certainly in CTE, where professional requirements change, and also disciplines change, and, computer science or something, things like that change a lot. But even in good old, English and philosophy and history, our idea of what we want to do with our degree changes. And so every new generation of faculty, and by generation I mean every few years, should take a minute to think, does this really still feel like what we're all about? An example, when we, again in English, looked at our mapping, in the spring of 18, we decided that our program outcomes didn't really tell the whole story, and we're going to go ahead and have a look at them and really define the degree in a way that we think is what we're really doing with it now. So those are all reasons to take some sort of action. Similarly, with this institutional map, the purpose of trying to think about which aspect of your course supports the institutional outcomes is primarily to find places institutionally where faculty can collaborate. Where do we have shared learning goals? Also, for us to reflect on shared learning goals. This is an opportunity to think about what we do have in common. Maybe for us to think about our role in general education or institutional outcomes. You know, maybe it hasn't occurred to us to put ethics as one of our areas of focus, but maybe it is, and maybe it isn't. It's a chance again to think about that. Some of the red flags are if none of your courses seem to relate to an institutional outcome. That seems highly unlikely, but if you don't see an outcome that makes that connection, maybe it's a question of the problems with the course or maybe with the wording of the outcome. Sometimes the courses might be in the GE transfer pattern, but they don't support specifically the general education outcomes. That's outcomes 2 through 6 of our institutional outcomes. So again, it's making sure that you've correctly identified where your course is contributing most to student institutional outcomes. I might add, by the way, from the institution's point of view, it's really interesting for us to see which of these institutional outcomes maybe don't get as much play. How many programs or rather courses or services cite ethics or social awareness and diversity as a focus? I mean, some of them do, obviously, but how much is that spread in other courses? So that would be something that's interesting for an institution. So you're going to have a look at mapping your outcomes, and it's going to be something which you'll probably be wanting to do pretty regularly. It's part of program review now. Assess your program, and that involves looking at how your outcomes relate to each other. So one suggestion is keep it simple. You know, all 5 outcomes in your math class or your history class do not have to support all the outcomes of your program. 1 is enough. Obviously, 2 or 3 is fine too. It's up to you, but you're not trying to tie everything to everything else. The second one is keep it real, and perhaps keep it prioritized. You know, in English, we actually do some quantitative reasoning work in our critical thinking, but that's not really what our subject is in the curriculum for. So it's all right to prioritize. Pick the 1 or maybe 2 institutional outcomes that you feel your course really is involved in. Point number 3, don't overthink it. It is easy to fall down a well and ask ourselves, yes, but what do we mean by critical thinking? And, you know, that's great. And that's one of the reasons to have this and have that discussion. But when you're making the link for the purposes of mapping your outcomes, just stick to what seems fairly plain and straightforward. And finally, don't be afraid to revise. Now, traditionally, the mapping of outcomes really served to act as a kind of conduit for data. So data collected under an outcome in any discipline or service that was linked to, say, the critical thinking outcome. Part of the idea was, well, we can retrieve that data and put it in a pot called critical thinking outcomes data, and we can analyze it. You know what? That's bad data. That will be, those activities will all be far too different. So really, the goal here is not to build some long-lasting conduit for your course level data to be funneled up to the institution. It is to create an opportunity for faculty to think about their curriculum and have a conversation about it and maybe take ownership of it again. Again, program outcomes may well revise, may not change from year to year to year. But a new, faculty may, with the passage of time after 10 years or so, or 2 years or 20, but faculty may feel like, this doesn't really say what we wanted to say. So don't be afraid to try something new. Finally, we're going to be holding mapping workshops held regularly throughout our program review cycle. Also, on request, contact your Student Learning Outcomes Assessment Coordinator, also College Assessment Committee. So if you are doing this for the first time, feel free to reach out and get some support. Thanks very much, and happy mapping.